Before bullets and bombs decided battle lines, armies were won and lost in factories and refineries. By 1943, Allied planners had a single terrifying fact burned into their notebooks. Germany did not simply fight on steel and blood. It fought on oil. Tanks, trucks, planes, even the trains that fed the front, all depended on a fragile lifeline. And at the heart of that lifeline was Ploiești. Nestled in the Romanian plains, Ploiești was more than a cluster of refineries. It was the pumping heart of Nazi Europe, a knot of cracking towers, pipelines, and storage tanks that turned crude into the petrol that moved Hitler's armies. A third of Axis petroleum flowed from those fields. Lose Ploiești, and the Reich would be forced to ration mechanics, slow offensives, cancel operations, and eventually leave steel stranded without fuel. This was not a distant problem. Commanders in Washington, London, and Cairo could name the stakes with cold clarity. Churchill would later call the oil wells of Eastern Europe the taproot of German war power. For the Allied airmen, Ploiești was a target that promised strategic impact, if a way could be found to reach it. But it wasn't a fortress of stone. It was a fortress of camouflage and denial. Smoke machines could hide refineries. Decoys, dummy stacks, and specially trained anti-aircraft units masked the true sites. Guns hid in orchards, searchlights waited behind church towers. Ploiești was defended not out of pride, but necessity. For Germany, it was survival. Confronted with this reality, Allied planners looked at the maps and the facts and felt something that was very close to desperation. Conventional bombing, the kind done from high altitude with bomber stream formations, would be thwarted by smoke screens and camouflage. Night attacks would scatter bombs across towns instead of refineries. Fighter escort from England could not reach so far. Distance, deception, and defense conspired to make Ploiești invulnerable to ordinary methods. There was only one idea that dared to break the logic of the map. Strike low, strike fast, and strike with surprise. Fly so low that radar and smoke did not matter. Fly through the valley like a hunting hawk and drop bombs under the noses of the defenders. But to do that, crews would risk everything. To fly at rooftop height over a refinery is to fly through the teeth of anti-aircraft, where flak became shrapnel, where tracer lined the air like a needle, where a single mistake could send a heavy bomber spinning into a burning sea. So the gamble was set. Call it audacity or call it necessity. The Allies would try something nobody in the Strategic Bombing Corps believed in. They would win or die trying.
If courage were a plan, Operation Tidal Wave still needed mathematics. The mission required solving a sequence of unbearable problems: distance, navigation, formation, and release. The aircraft chosen to carry the plan was the consolidated B-24 Liberator, a long-range heavy bomber with a slender, efficient wing and a thirst for fuel. Its range let it reach Romania from bases in North Africa, but the plane's performance at low altitude and in formation would be tested beyond anything it had yet seen. The route was brutal: Libya to the Mediterranean, threading a course that clipped Albania, crossed the rugged peaks of Yugoslavia, and then descend into the Ploiești Basin. Every mile would be over hostile or at least neutral territory, with occupied coasts bristling and fighters alert. Refueling stops were not an option. The bombers would carry their full load, and with it, the knowledge that there would be no fighter escort for much of the trip. Navigation would be the axis of success or failure. To strike accurately at rooftop height, crews could not rely on celestial navigation or instruments alone. They would need precise visual landmarks, tightly timed turns, and a sequence of lead planes calling the shots. The entire plan hinged on perfect timing and absolute faith in the lead element. Even the bombs themselves were adapted. Instead of heavy fragmentation or high-altitude patterns, crews used delayed action fuses to allow bombs to penetrate and ignite fuel processing equipment. The formation would break into individual elements at the target, each bomber sweeping into its assigned refinery and dumping its load in a coordinated series of attacks. The goal? Set refineries ablaze and cause fires so hot and so extensive that pipelines and storage tanks would be rendered useless. On paper, it was audacious. To the doctrine of daylight high-altitude strategic bombing, it was a violation. Yet on paper also was the moral and tactical obligation. If Ploiești continued to turn oil for the Reich, the Eastern Front, the Africa Corps, and the Atlantic U-boats would keep fighting. The planners admitted the truth quietly. This mission was a one-day gamble with enormous payoff if it worked. The crews were briefed not like trainees, but like men told they were about to test a new form of warfare. They trained in desert strips and practiced low-level approaches. Crews rehearsed turns and suppression tactics. Mechanics wrestled with fuel loads and bomb racks. Intelligence teams mapped the refineries as best they could. And as practice hardened into a plan, the men who would fly it read the maps with a mixture of pride and dread.
There are decisions ordinary men make in extraordinary times that become the measure of courage. The air crews chosen for tidal wave were volunteers in a qualified sense. Some were asked, some offered themselves, all understood the odds. These were pilots and gunners drawn from the 9th and 12th Air Forces, seasoned in desert operations but untested in the unique terror they would face over Romania. Imagine a young pilot standing under a starlit sky in Benghazi, cheeks sunburned from the desert, checking instruments with fingers numb from the chill. The briefing tent smells of engine oil and cigarette smoke. Officers hand out maps and cards, slow and deliberate. They point to the Ploiești Valley and speak of the stakes in clipped sentences. They do not sugar the math. Casualties would be high. Survivors might be captured. Still, the men listen without flinching. The crews came from towns and small cities across the United States, from different walks of life, farmers, mechanics, college students, now welded into the same steel skeleton of a B-24. They formed tight bonds. The bomber was a small community: pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, flight engineer, radio operator, waist gunners, tail gunner. Each had a role that could save or doom the whole ship. Letters were written in the evenings, quick strokes to family and lovers, sometimes unsigned notes tucked into shirts. Men signed names on the flight manifest with a steady hand. They trained with grim humor, a way to keep fear manageable. They smoked, swapped jokes, and tuned their guns. In the mess tents, they argued about music and baseball as if permanence were still an option. To the planners, the human cost was the price of strategy. For the crews, the acceptance of risk was personal. What they did not know, and what even the best intelligence could not foresee, was how tightly fate would hinge on navigation, how a single misplaced turn could change history. The morning of August 1st, 1943 came with the same indifferent light that had greeted thousands of other missions. Engines rolled, crews climbed into Liberators and felt the familiar vibration, the machine's heartbeat under their souls. There was no fanfare. Only the ritual of checklists and last glances. Takeoff from the desert fields was a domino of heavy aircraft lifting into the blue.
Formation after formation organized itself into the great, long columns that would become the route to Ploiești. The initial leg was mercifully uneventful. Sun on canvas, the Mediterranean a glittering witness. But as the liberators crossed the Ionian Sea and reached the mountainous spine of the Balkans, their nerves tightened. Mountain flying at low altitude is a brutal teacher. Winds climb and tumble unexpectedly, and radio silence made it worse. The lead navigators consulted maps, dead reckoning, and the occasional visible landmark. The mission's timeline was strict. Lateness could mean flying into alert defenses or missing the window of surprise. As noon leaned toward afternoon, radio chatter grew terse. Pilots worked through fatigue, the monotony broken by the necessity of precise turns and speed control. Some crews encountered mechanical glitches. The B-24 was not invincible. Others watched with an uneasy eye for enemy fighters expected to respond. But the Luftwaffe seemed lethargic that day. A small mercy before the storm. Then came the most catastrophic moment. Over the rugged Balkans, where mountains crowded the sky and landmarks could trick the eye, the lead formation misidentified the crucial turning point. It was not a lone dramatic crash, but a subtle navigational error, a missed landmark, a wrong heading that would cascade. One wing of the formation turned on the wrong point and started a course that would put them over Bucharest rather than the intended attack run. That single mistake fractured the plan. In an instant, coordinated precision dissolved into chaos. Without the tight formation to protect them and to synchronize their runs, bomber groups now had to improvise under fire. Orders from command were muddled by distance and smoke. Pilots tightened grips and adjusted to a new reality. They would attack when and where they could. The gamble had just grown more dangerous.
War is a ledger of small errors with outsized consequences. The navigation error at Ploiești is one of those entries. To the planners back in Cairo, the mission sequence had been robust, but the real world is messier. Heads down in cockpits, men looked at roads and rivers and oil fields and tried to make them mean what the map said they meant. A misread river bend, a mountain gap mistaken for a valley, a cloud bank obscuring a key marker. Any of these could turn a coordinated strike into a scattershot gamble. The wrong turn had immediate consequences. B-24s that should have swept into the target zone in synchronized waves found themselves early or late, isolated and exposed. The element of surprise that the plan had banked on was partially lost. Romanian and German defenders, alarmed by strange silhouettes and unusual approach vectors, opened up with everything they had. For the flight leaders, that moment required instant judgment. Should they abort, try to regroup, or press on under a new scheme? Most commanders chose to press on. They reasoned that withdrawing, turning back to North Africa without dropping bombs, would leave the refineries intact and make the crew's sacrifice meaningless. So they adapted. The mission devolved into a collection of small, fierce attacks rather than one synchronized blow. This is where the human dimension shows itself starkly. Individual pilots now had to decide, fly into a gauntlet in hopes of hitting a refinery or peel away and live to fly another day. Many chose the first. Men signaled each other with curt radio calls, hard turns, bursts of machine gun fire. Bombing runs that should have been minutes apart were now chaotic but relentless. The sky above Ploiești became a weaving, roaring theater of steel and flame. And yet, even in the mess, remarkable discipline showed. Some crews managed to hit primary targets. Some bombs struck vital installations. Some liberators flew through smoke and splashed ordnance into storage tanks. The navigation error had thrown away much of the plan's elegance, but it did not erase the will of the crews to make a difference.
When the first liberators dove in, Ploiești answered with everything it could muster. Anti-aircraft guns, camouflaged and concealed, erupted in synchronized violence. The effect at low altitude is almost impossible to convey in flat prose. Flak blossoms explode within yards of a bomber's wing. Shrapnel rakes fuselage and fuel tanks. Tracer lines stream past gunners' faces. Engines choke on smoke. Pilots reported seeing battalions of fire, columns of black smoke rising like a pitched battlefield sunrise. Some aircraft passed so close to refinery structures they could read painted letters on tanks. One B-24, its wing trailing flame after being hit, still completed its run before falling away. Waste gunners filled empty sky with desperate bursts, hoping to break up attacking fighters and distract ground crews. Refineries themselves were infernal factories. Crude oil ignited, turning storage tanks into pressure cookers. When struck, these tanks ruptured and sprayed fuel that fed fires so expansive they created their own weather. Updrafts that buffeted planes, pillars of flame that made the air shimmer. Bombs hitting pipelines sent geysers of burning fuel into the sky, and those geysers in turn spread the blaze from one installation to the next. For the men below and above, reality altered. Crews saw entire complexes go dark under black smoke, then flare as secondary explosions lit the valley. Some gunners watched as friendly bombers disappeared in puffs of white or orange. Others saw comrades bail out into parachutes and then be swallowed by the haze of battle. The sound, engines, explosions, guns, layered into an endless ring. Amid the chaos, heroics occurred. Flight engineers crawled across burning fuselages to check gauges. Bombardiers made micro-adjustments and released their payloads with a steadiness that bordered on ritual. When radios failed, hand signals and prearranged maneuvers had to suffice. It was a war in miniature, one plane at a time, and a testament to the training and resolve of crews who, in ordinary life, had been plumbers and teachers and mechanics.
No mission plan anticipates every possibility. As bombs dropped and fires spread, Ploiești's defenders shifted tactics. Fighters finally climbed from their airfields, and Romanian anti-aircraft units focused on intersections where liberators passed low and slow. For bomber crews, survival became a sequence of split-second decisions. Cut throttle to avoid a collision, bank hard to avoid flak, throttle up to evade a pursuing fighter. Each choice could mean life or death. Many B-24s did not survive. The official losses were grim. Dozens of bombers shot down, crash-landed, or crippled beyond repair. Men were killed in action, wounded, or captured. Survivors told stories of parachutes tangled in burning trees, of forced landings in enemy fields, and then long, uncertain walks through hostile countryside. The sky was strewn with tests of human endurance. But losses do not tell the whole story. Some aircraft, though mortally wounded, still managed to deliver their bombs into the heart of refineries. Some gunners, out of ammunition and under fire, clambered to open hatches and launch fire extinguishers to stop flames that threatened to consume their ships. Some crews saved others, towing damaged planes to emergency fields when engines quit, or dropping messages to warn low-flying compatriots of hidden battery positions. On the ground, refinery workers and firefighters faced carnage. Men in coveralls and gas masks ran into burning fields to shut valves, to cut lines, to try to prevent the secondary catastrophe that could spread fire across the plain. Some risked their lives to pull survivors from wreckage. It was an industrial hell, and civilians as well as soldiers paid the price. Amid the loss and the pain, moments of quiet humanity appeared. Pilots who returned to friendly fields wrote notes of condolence. Medics treated Germans and Americans alike when they could. The mission had cracked open the veneer of war to expose the common elements beneath: smoke, loss, courage, binding participants in an unspoken kinship of survivors. After the inferno, the remaining liberators needed to escape a valley now wide awake and lethal. Fuel was an immediate problem. Many planes had burned fuel to make their low runs and now found their tanks light. Engines that had taken punishment sputtered. Hydraulic lines bled. Pilots had to make impossible calculations. Could they reach the nearest Allied field in Egypt or Libya? Did they have time to make a forced landing in neutral Turkey? Each option had a cost. Some crews headed inland, hoping to find a patch of friendly or at least neutral territory. Others tried to limp west, skirting known fighter bases and hugging terrain. A few made the excruciating choice to crash land near friendly partisans, who sometimes sheltered crewmen and ferried them to safety. The partisan networks in the Balkans would become crucial in saving lives, but not without risk. Civilians who aided airmen often paid their lives. Capture was frequent. Prisoner stacks in Romania and Germany would receive airmen who parachuted or were forced down. The fate of these men varied. Some were treated according to the conventions of war. Others were humiliated or beaten. For families back home, the lack of news turned days into an unbearable fog. Back in the Mediterranean, commanders tallied the cost. The damage inflicted on Ploiești was severe and visible. Fires, destroyed installations, ruptured storage tanks. But the refineries were resilient. Repair crews worked with grim efficiency to restore capacity. Within weeks, production and parts of the complex rose again. The strategic effect was real, but less decisive than planners had hoped. Which raised the old, bitter question: was the price worth the damage? For a nation at war, the calculus of sacrifice is never simple. Men had flown into a furnace, many had not come back. Their deeds would be celebrated, medals awarded, names inscribed, yet the refineries lived to burn another day. History would judge not just on the bodies lost, but on the lessons learned and the tactical shifts that followed.
In the immediate aftermath, voices rose from both ends of the spectrum. Some framed Ploiești as a disaster, a mission that racked up heavy losses and failed to deliver a decisive knockout punch. Others called it heroic, daring men who flew into hell to deliver a blow to the enemy's lungs. Both assessments contain truth. The attack inflicted heavy damage, destroyed tanks, and set key installations ablaze. It also exacted a terrible price in aircraft and lives. Critically, the lesson the U.S. Army Air Forces took from Ploiești was not purely moral but tactical. Unescorted daylight raids deep into enemy territory were too costly without fighter cover and without flawless navigation. The raid changed doctrine. It accelerated the push for longer-range fighters and tighter navigation training, and it fed into the shift toward coordinated strategic bombing with proper escort and electronic navigation tools. By 1944, with P-51 Mustangs and better radar, Allied air power evolved into a far more lethal instrument, one that would later strangle the Luftwaffe and cut Axis supply lines more thoroughly. Another legacy of Ploiești was in the awards list. Several members of the mission received the Medal of Honor and other decorations. Their citations read like poetry and iron, acts of individual valor that stand apart from strategy. These medals recognized the bravery of men who, given the chance, would have flown again. But medals do not replace lost fathers, husbands, and brothers. The families who received telegrams of condolence carried the mission's human cost. For the air crews who returned, the scars, visible and invisible, stayed. War is always a ledger of losses. Ploiești was a particularly heavy page. History remembers Ploiești not for a single definition, but for its complexity. As a mission of extraordinary courage, a tactical failure to achieve decisive strategic paralysis, and a turning point for air warfare doctrine. The stories told by survivors, the blackened fields, and the official records weave a narrative about what it means to try something that seemed impossible. Strategically, Ploiești did not topple the Reich. The refineries were repaired, and the Axis found other ways to stretch fuel supplies. Yet, the raid had consequences that rippled beyond the immediate damage. It forced the Allies to recognize the limits of unescorted daylight bombing, and sped the development of tactics and technology that would later be decisive. It also showed the enemy something important. Allied air power would reach deep into continental Europe, and the cost of denying it would be high. But perhaps the most lasting legacy is human. The Ploiești Raid became a story told in mess halls and living rooms, a tale of ordinary men asked to perform extraordinary action. They did not ask for fame. They asked for a chance to hit the heart of an enemy that had made war profitable and efficient. In the end, their story is less about strategic calculus and more about the human will to answer an impossible call. Today, the towers of those refineries are museum relics or gone entirely. The men who flew those missions dwindled into history. But when their names are spoken, what we hear is a crackle of radio static and the smell of fuel. A reminder that some chapters of war are written not by generals on maps, but by those who climbed into cold, humming aircraft and chose to fly into the fire.
In August 1943, the sky above Ploiești burned brighter than most of Europe. Men in olive and beige uniforms carved a story of courage and error, of calculation and sacrifice. They taught a brutal lesson. Boldness can force the enemy's hand, but it can also expose the flaws in any plan. Strategy without logistics is vanity, and bravery without support is tragedy. Operation Tidal Wave remains one of the most dramatic, costly, and inspirational raids of the Second World War. It was a day when the air itself became a battlefield, when men measured themselves not by the miles they flew, but by the weight of what they risked. The Ploiești Raid stands as testament that in war, the most incandescent fires are often those lit in the name of survival, and the worst disasters are those that teach us how to win the next time.